Welcome to the Dance Reel podcast. I'm Kate Histon-Behrend. To be part of our community, subscribe or follow this channel. This episode was sponsored by Master Dancer Mindset. Know yourself, be yourself, and express yourself on and off the stage. Today on the Dance Reel podcast, I am joined by the remarkable Dr. Kathrina Farrugia-Kriel, an internationally respected dance scholar, writer and educator, a senior fellow of Advanced HE and licentiate of the Royal Academy of Dance. Kathrina's research spans 20th and 21st century ballet, pedagogy and performance history. She's the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Contemporary Ballet and the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of Ballet Pedagogy. With a career bridging academia and industry, Kathrina brings a rich perspective on ballet's past, present and future. Welcome, Kathrina, to my podcast, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Kate.
I'm very excited because you have spent your life studying dance in not just a physical way, in a scholarly way.
I know it's been a real interesting, probably 26 years coming in September. But yes, I'm excited to chat about stuff to do with dance scholarship and how I got into it.
And that's actually my first question. How did you get into it? What first drew you to dance and then to dance scholarship?
So I grew up on the tiny island of Malta, which is the bottom of the Mediterranean, surrounded by sea, quite an idyllic childhood. But dance was always sort of part of the culture that I was brought up in. We did ballet, jazz. I also danced in a folk company, a Maltese folk company. So as early as 16, I was sort of on that professional stage dancing rep, which was sort of shaped by the choreographer's sort of insight into Maltese culture. So it may not necessarily be historically accurate, but it was certainly giving a sort of an insight into how dance manifested itself within the Maltese culture, both in terms of working class and also middle class and also upper class. So I kind of had a full sort of education, even if on the island back in the 80s and 90s, there was no professional dance school, although teachers trained with institutions like the Royal Academy of Dance or the Imperial Society of Teachers of Dancing. There was no vocational school, but actually, funnily enough, nor was I interested in that. I remember looking at the Dancing Times and also the Dance Gazette, which would arrive by post, maybe sort of a couple of weeks later than it would in England. But I think the most important thing was it piqued that curiosity. I think I was probably more swayed by the reviews of companies, the adverts for the kind of repertoire that they were performing, and I knew I was slightly limited. I remember in a previous podcast interview, I talked a little bit about a summer television festival. So we're going back to the 80s. There was this really interesting summer festival where companies like New York City Ballet were sort of shown to perform Serenade, Prodigal Son, and all of those Balanchine reps that I thought, whoa, what is that all about? Of course, on a tiny island with very limited insight into the performative side of ballet, with professional companies visiting occasionally, it was a real revelation. So going back to sort of maybe mid-90s, I became more aware of, okay, look at the Dancing Times, lots of different adverts. I was aware of different schools of training. I wasn't overly motivated to be a professional dancer, but I was interested in dance. What do we learn by watching the dance? I was a good academic at school, and that was something that I think I carried with me. I went to a Jesuit school for sixth form, so post-secondary, and that really instilled values of excellence in education, and that sort of stayed with me right the way through in coming to the United Kingdom, because then I decided to audition for the RAD's 3-year teacher training program at headquarters. So I started that in September 2000. And from then I just decided, oh gosh, I caught the bug. I wanted to do a master's. And I remember Professor Joan White saying, well, think strategically on what kind of MA you want to have, because I was adamant I wanted to do an MA in choreography. And she kind of swayed me to go, well, have a look at an MA that will give you maybe a module in choreography and other topics. And I think that was probably one of the best advice anybody ever gave me, because it opened the doors to having different paths within my career. And then once I'd caught the bug to do further study, I started a PhD in Oh, it was the autumn of 2006, and I finished up in 2012. So there's been 12 years, formative years of study, right from BA through to finishing my PhD. But I remember somebody commenting on the fact that I had very good analytical skills, and I think that stems back right away to a first year module that we had at the RAD, and that was analyzing movement vocabulary. And a lovely teacher called Hilary Moss used to take us through vocabulary analysis. And even if it was just ballet vocabulary that we were analyzing, how does the foot track up the leg? Where is it going across?
Mm.
It's all those little details that your analytical eye. And I remember another wonderful teacher called Elaine Ray, who's actually both Hilary Moss and Elaine Ray have passed away. Um, Elaine Ray used to say, use your analytical eyes. Do not prejudge what your students are doing before you've seen what you've seen in front of you. And so that's really sort of my formative educational years, and what sort of led me to then, probably when from 2013, I thought, gosh, I've finished my PhD. What am I going to do in my time? And I started out with a very short scholarly article on a South African teacher called Yvonne Mounsey. Why she was born in South Africa, I'd probably say most of her career was either spent in the United States or marginally in Europe. And that's really where I wanted to start writing, and making things accessible to the readers. And yeah, and then that's sort of another 13 years down the line, I'm just here.
Wow. And you've lived in various dance cultures. What threads run through them all?
So as I've mentioned, I grew up on the tiny island of Malta, and I say tiny because it is tiny compared with other countries that, obviously I moved to the United Kingdom, a much bigger island, and I've lived here for 26 years. And in the interim, traveled a lot to the United States. I joined the Society for Dance History Scholars, as it was known back then, in 2012. Eventually, we saw the transition into the Dance Studies Association, which is alive and thriving today. And so frequent travel to the United States gave me an opportunity to, embed myself into a more scholarly world, but also opening up a couple of new areas of research, and particularly going to the New York Public Library, which although was already in my radar in 2007 as a PhD student. But you see, it was all before we had YouTube, the phenomenon of YouTube, where you can see clips of this and that. And I'm always amazed at how much stuff ends up on YouTube. So doing a PhD before this era of YouTube, going to the New York Public Library. And I remember there was a particular moment, probably about 2008 maybe, where at the New York Public Library, the person beside me was Christopher Wheeldon, and he was watching a recording of Ashton's Monotones 2. And we just had a little chat about, what are you watching and what's it for? So the US was really instrumental in shaping and, working with colleagues who really were aspirational. And that's where I was able to forge connections with not just colleagues, but also collaborators, particularly Jill Nunes Jensen, who was also interested in the same field. And we kind of buddied up to go, well, very few people are writing about contemporary ballet, and nobody's even defined it. So why don't we get on and do it? So the United States was a really fertile ground for me. And then I did a bit of traveling to South Africa and did some teaching, which again helped me calibrate a couple of teaching nuances, where when I talked about the continent, I was talking about Europe, of course, but I was on a different continent, in the African continent. So again, getting me sort of connected with different people and different insights. And I think that's really opened, for me, the biggest thread across is learning to work with different people, learning to appreciate where people come from, what their value system are. They might be very different to my values, but how do we work together? How do we recognize that your points of view are just as valid as my points of view? And in a sense, it kind of moved into this phase where most of my books are about finding a voice and giving people a voice. And that to me is the thread, because we've all got a story, we've all got something to say, but how are we saying it and what are we bringing to our story?
Yeah, wow, that's insightful. And what do you believe makes a dance teacher truly transformative today?
I think there's an element of, we all hold on to those teachers we really, really kind of thought, gosh, that person just blew my mind away, the way they taught a class. Or and it could be also in a academic class. It doesn't have to be in a sort of
Mm.
practical context as well. I remember somebody wrote something, and this was again Professor White, who said everybody remembers a good teacher, but I dare say also everybody remembers a bad teacher, because that can really stay with you. Teaching for me, and I've been reading Susan Foster's for a couple book called Valuing Dance for a couple of years now. It was a 2019 book. I picked it up in 2021, and I was unwell. I had cancer, and I took
Oh,
this book in with me into hospital, because I thought I really need to hold on to my moments of sanity, of this is grounding me, this is who I
yeah.
am. And so I held on to this book and I started reading. And Foster talks a lot about the value of dance, what from an economic point of view, that's really important, but also from
Mm.
gifting that moment to go, wow. And I remember in the interim of that diagnosis period and coming out the other side, going to do a dance class, my adult ballet class. And when I was at the bar, the person who was teaching the class kept me grounded, kept
Mm.
me really focused. And I think that gift to be able to connect people with that in the moment, I'll forget about all the stuff that is happening. I'm just going to be present in that moment. Same whether you're in an academic class, to hold on to people's attention, to make it meaningful, that's a real gift. And I think what's really valuable in terms of teaching is making things meaningful for people. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing our tondus? Why are we looking at a research method? In my current day job, I have maybe about 100 musical theatre students. I don't see them all at the same time, but there's a big group of them, and you have to connect with each one individually, and that's quite a hard task. But to return back to making this experience meaningful, why are we here today? What are we taking away? That to me is good teaching.
Mm, that's beautiful. And I'm thinking about newer teachers coming through and maybe listening to this. What advice could you give based on your experience and your knowledge on how a teacher can anchor in? I'm sort of thinking as well, a teacher needs to find their meaning for teaching to be able to provide space for students to experience their moment. What could you advise younger teachers coming through on that?
So, of course, with a younger teacher, particularly if they're going through a course of study and education, an educationally shaped teacher training course, you're going to have to demonstrate, and you're going to have to kind of, explore the key values that maybe the assessment is asking you to do. And that's something that you're going to have to learn how to go, okay, this is what they are looking for. Let's shape our class in this particular way. Let's give feedback in that particular way. But you will find your voice through time. And that's really important. When I was an undergraduate, and I prepped this for you, Kate, because I thought, there's no point in me talking about the book without showing you the book. So this was
Yeah,
one of my
please.
um, key moments, which as an undergraduate, it was called The Art of Teaching Ballet. This came out probably a couple of years before I was an undergraduate student. And I remember my course leader, Holly Price, who has also passed away since. And I feel like I need to mention these names because these were really instrumental. And even if and here's the disclaimer, in terms of I've worked in higher education since 2005, but teaching, although I wasn't in the studio all the time since 2005, teaching shapes the way we think, it shapes the way we communicate. And Holly Price said to us, go and have a look at this book. This is a really, really useful text. And I read this book diligently, going through it, finding out. But what piqued me more was, gosh, everybody does it so differently. What are their influences? Who's inspiring them? And that's something that I, kind of want to reaffirm, to say you will find your voice, but you will also carry on those people who have inspired you. Um, Fabulous teachers for me, Susie Cooper, who sadly passed away about 6 months ago. She was instrumental, bringing that joy, that sense of humor into class, but also having a great empathy with people. And
Mm,
again,
yeah.
and this is something that if we kind of hop into this forthcoming book that Adeshola Akinle and I have co-edited, It's called the Oxford Handbook of Ballet Pedagogy. I have to think about it because it's quite a lot.
Do you have a picture of it there?
We don't yet. We don't have a front cover. We have given the publishers images of what we want on the front cover, but we don't have a front cover mocked up yet. It's in that virtual space at the moment where it is a book. It is with the publishers. It's suspended in the air. We have about 44 amazing chapters. And again, the purpose of the book is to really reach out to people, to go, you will find your voice. You will find your voice after however many years. I'm not going to say 5 years. I'm not going to say 10. I'm not going to say 44, because we have got a range of contributors who are early career starters, where they're kind of really doing some pioneering work. I'm thinking people who work intersectionally, so working across Black community spaces, queer community spaces, working in higher education. What happens when all of those three align? How do you change the way you teach? We've got some inspirational people who have worked in higher education and taught ballet for a substantial amount of time. We've also got people who work with different abilities, loss of hearing, loss of sight, people who are working with healthy older people, and people living with DIS in brackets ease, where that emphasis is on you close the DIS of the ease. In other words, it's not just about living with cancer or living with Parkinson's, but it's finding ways in those moments to go, I can breathe and I am living with disease, but I can also live with ease in my class. So it's such a broad spectrum of people talking about practice. And that's, again, what we hope with the book is it will be an inspiration to students, teachers, graduates, people who have taught in the sector for a long time, and again, working across different sectors, the recreational sector, the professional sector, but also looking at higher education, looking at older learners, so really broad spectrum, and to really reaffirm that ballet pedagogy is not about teaching a syllabus of sorts. We have people talking about steps, but it is not about how to execute the steps. It's about how we communicate with other people in the room, thinking about empathy, thinking about inclusion. You know, we had this contributor, a PhD student, working in California, but tussling with their identity as a Latina person.
Yeah.
And how do they find their voice as a Latina person working in Southern California, working on the border onto Mexico, and working, you know, a really interesting set of values and what they bring to their pedagogy. And it took us a bit of a while, maybe a year and a bit, to actually get this chapter into its final shape. Why? Because the person was still tussling with finding their voice. Once they found their voice, they flew. And that's a really important part. So it's such an, such a brilliant question. So thank you for that and letting me ramble on.
Yeah, no, it's interesting finding your voice, right? Just that concept alone. What do you think stops people from finding their voice? Or that, like, what do you think could be a limitation, or to even not be curious about finding your voice?
I mean, the word curious is absolutely, central. I remember reading a lot about William Forsythe, who I've written a program note about his work, but also spent a lot of time thinking about his work, because one of the choreographers I wrote about for my PhD was hugely inspired by Forsythe. And Mauro Bigonzetti mentioned, it's all about curiosity. If you're not curious about your art form, if you're not curious about the way people teach, if you're not curious about, why am I doing this? Why have I always done this? Why are we doing this all the time? If your answer is because we've always done it this way, then that is slightly problematic, because you almost begin to, I use the word ossify, I mean, literally like a fossil, because it becomes a fixed practice that just won't evolve. I took a leap of faith about 2 years ago, and I decided I needed to look into another space, not just teaching about dance. And so I entered the world of musical theatre, and I thought, it's the most joyous kind of space in this world. But it was also hugely, I was frightened to go, gosh, I'm going to, have to swat up on knowing about musical theatre. But I then found my niche. I found my area that I've started almost like a new chapter in my life to go, I'm writing about dance and choreography in musical theatre. And if I hadn't taken that leap, and if I hadn't sort of gone, right, let's do this, I felt like I was jumping off a diving board, but I didn't land in the pool. Where I was landing, I wasn't quite sure. I did eventually land in a pool, and the pool was choreography in musical theatre. So I am currently working on a new book proposal, which the clock is ticking, and we need to send it off to the publishers, myself and my co-editor. But I've also, interestingly, returned to the work of Justin Peck, New York City ballet choreographer and artistic advisor, but is also working on Broadway as well. And in 2024, a new musical, it was called a dance musical called Illinois, was premiered, or it went through its various stages until it made, of course, its Broadway debut and went through a number of different venues, finishing up at St. James's. And Peck went on to win a Tony Award for Illinois, but what's really fascinating is what he brings to musical theatre choreography through his ballet, through his contemporary approach. And it's funny how, for me, Justin Peck originally resided within the contemporary ballet book that I had edited and came out in 2021. But now I'm finding myself writing about a choreographer who's working in musical theatre and is bringing out his voice in that field. And so that, in a sense, becomes almost that curiosity. So remember, for anybody listening, to go, I'm fearful of doing something different. Don't be fearful. Try it out, because you don't know where that may lead. That's the beautiful thing about living. We try things. So my big advice would be, don't be afraid. Try something different. See what works, what doesn't work, and learn from that.
That's beautiful. And we are in the arts, and that is an essential thing for art to live, to grow, to breathe, to create art.
And it's got to breathe. And it's the same with scholarship, writing about dance.
Yep.
It has to grow. One of the reasons, and I'm now on to my third handbook with Oxford University Press, for me, the books were always gaps. And the gaps were, wouldn't it be great if we had a collection of essays to support people understanding what is contemporary ballet? It was a term, it was elusive. I remember chatting with now Sir Matthew Bourne in San Francisco at San Francisco's 2018 huge 12 new works, a huge festival of new choreographies. And he asked me that question. He said, what on earth is contemporary ballet? How do you define it? And of course, I said, well, we're working on the definition, but what we put in our book, particularly as we wrote the introduction at the start of the pandemic in 2020, we realized that this was actually going to be a term that's starting to kind of, yes, there's a definition, but it does need to, it will evolve. And we did end up writing an introduction that said, we've included so many people. This is huge. This is a really big 50 plus chapter book. It's a doorstopper of a book. But we recognize that the field is evolving. We didn't include, unfortunately, people like Kyle Abraham, but Kyle Abraham has started to work since 2020 with a number of different ballet companies, including New York City Ballet, American Ballet Theatre, the Royal Ballet. So even looking, whilst the choreography is evolving, the dance scholarship as well has to evolve as well in tandem with it. My editor at the Oxford University Press, who really sort of highlighted this important point. Without the choreography, without the work, we have no scholarship. Without the scholarship, the work may just become a recording that ends up on YouTube, or snippets of it, or that companies upload moments from the choreography or moments from a season, or it may end up in a review in the New York Times or in any of the newspapers or an online blog. But then you have to go and search for it. And this is where the importance of these books really become handy, because that's where it comes alive for students and for anybody engaged in the sort of education within dance, within pedagogy, and now, of course, within choreography and musical theatre.
What an inspiration you are.
I think, I wonder also sometimes, inspiration, I think you are the product of the people who have shaped you. And all of those formative teachers who were there holding my back in the early days, both as a young sort of teacher training student to my mentors within higher education, the late Gian Andrea Poesio, who was prolific, but sadly his life was cut short. And, those people who really kind of have your back, or the people who give you that first opportunity to publish, who believe in you, you are kind of the product of those people, the village that makes you and drives you. So, yeah.
Oh. And why do you think it's important to recover underrepresented figures in ballet history?
Problem is, we're very 21st century driven in this life. We have phones, we have YouTube, we have things that we can readily access. But what happens to those people who were around 50, 60 years ago, or even going back maybe 70s and 80s, where there's sort of some grainy footage, but everyone's going to forget about X and Y if they haven't got maybe a Twitter account or somebody who's constantly plugging in on social media. So those people from the past need and deserve to be given a space, in the sense we need to look back to the past to learn about how we can do things in the present, or even look to the future. In 2012, when I finished my PhD, I thought, gosh, what am I going to do with myself? And I decided to look at the work of Yvonne Mounsey and the kind of school she set up, called West Side School of Ballet in Santa Monica in Los Angeles. And from then I thought, actually something serendipitously happened to me. I wanted to interview one of my first teachers, my first ballet teacher, Daphne Lungar-Mifsud, back in Malta. And the conference organizers said, look, in addition to doing this, could you bring in somebody else, a woman called Tanya Bayona, who was also a contemporary of Daphne Lungar-Mifsud? And I said, oh, well, maybe we can extend it to all of this and have a bigger conversation and talk about different things, because they were both from the same generation. They both studied with the same teacher, Natalie Puciatin. And then all of a sudden, I found myself looking at these reams of photographs and documents and papers, and eventually costumes emerge, and all of this big treasure trove of stuff. And I thought, somebody's got to write about Puciatin, and I felt it needed to be done. So I put it in a book proposal, and lo and behold, that's where Puciatin and the Art of Ballet in Malta emerged in 2020 as a book. But that was really the ode to, let's not forget where we have come from. And what was really interesting as I wrote the book was it started to make bigger connections to things like the Ballet Russe repertoire, teachers from the Imperial Ballet who migrated to Europe. And what I found as a result of Puciatin studied in Paris with Lyubov Egorova. Now, there was nothing in English, or certainly that I could trace beyond some of the interviews of dancers with Egorova that were lodged at the New York Public Library. I read through the transcripts and I thought, oh, great. But then I thought, there's a lot more to this. What does it look like in practice? And so two things began to emerge. One, I was interested in connecting Egorova's teachings to the bigger Imperial Ballet School training system. And that went back to the Kasavina syllabus, which Tamara Kasavina had designed for the RAD in order to really give students an insight into the different schools of training. Yeah. And I started to join the dots to go, well, if Kasavina had also trained with Cicchetti, Beretta in Milan in 1907. So all of this started to kind of snowball and get a bigger picture, but just how linked everything is and just how rich the field is. So I felt like, somebody who was quite marginal, very small island of Malta, but she made a huge contribution. So it was for me imperative that people like Puciatin were not to be forgotten. And so, when you keep that in mind, to go, great people, great teachers, but if they start to be forgotten, then that becomes a big problem. So what's a problem for me anyway? And what are we going to do about it? We've got to do something. Yeah.
And I'm noticing a problem for me is younger students not actually these days going and seeing a ballet. They're looking on YouTube or Instagram or TikTok for these quick fix little videos of snippets of what's cool, and they're not even studying the ballet repertoire in actually going to see live performances.
I mean, it is a privilege to be able to get to the theatre.
Yeah.
We know certainly in London it is not cheap to go to the theatre.
True.
But and I know there's a campaign going round to get children into theatre to watch
Mm.
plays, to watch musicals, to watch dance at least once in their life.
Yeah.
Obviously, we've got different groups of people, different affluences. So there'll
Yes.
be some children who will be able to go to watch musicals, and but I think it starts for me, and certainly with my experience of being a mother, was taking my little boys to watch children's theatre, which is 40 to 45 minutes long, and getting them to sit through and build up curiosity, but build up also that ability to go, even if it's something I don't like, I'm going to sit through it and I'm going
Yeah.
to kind of learn about. I mean, I've got fond memories, maybe these are my biases as a mother, of watching puppetry and looking at all the Julia Donaldson little stories coming to life in movement and in
Yeah.
song, but starting from good habits, good sleep habits, good hygiene habits, good theatre habits, building up that resilience to go, let's go and watch and let's learn about something, or learn about a story through a different medium, a different form. So there are a number of things to really, yes, to get away from the scrolling and the quick fixes of the five
Mm.
minutes. And, I do hope that we will, in a decade's time, have students with concentration spans that go beyond a TikTok video, because it's very dangerous to think that all I need to know is from a TikTok video. I'm not on TikTok, but I know my students who enjoy creating and making, and that's a very good skill set of digital skills that, gosh, I wouldn't know where to start. Um, but I think we just do need to weigh up and be mindful. And again, it takes a whole village, right, to raise
Yeah.
children and students. So that's the whole importance of productions, school productions, learning to watch other people doing their dance in rehearsal, and then building up through rehearsals to get an insight onto, right, we're ready, we've got show day, here we go. And it's building up those good habits and those good influences, and embrace technology, because it's not going to disappear. That's the thing, it's going to be around. And we've just got to learn how to have the old fashioned stuff, the traditional way, with the 21st century digital way, and finding the balance of the two. For me, that's where our challenge is as humans, making sure that we are not just you know, technology driven, but also, engaging in that live spectacle where possible, if we can allow for people to do that in person.
Yeah. What's a truth about the dance world that took you maybe years to admit to yourself?
Firstly, we're connected. We are all connected. It's just so bizarre how you always know somebody who knows somebody else. Um, And it's interesting how you and I got chatting through Marie Walton Mahon, who's
Yeah.
also contributing to the Oxford Handbook of Ballet Pedagogy. So we're all connected there. We're all connected wherever we are in the world, whether you're in Australia. And I think I touched down in Australia in 2018 for a week, and I had to deliver a project, and that was it, and returned home. But it's amazing how there's always connections to people, whether you're, north of the equator, south of the equator, global north, global south. There's so many different connections. So that, certainly resonates with me. And also that we evolve. There's something
Yeah.
that, even, and everybody's got different parameters of evolving. Some people will kind of add a little bit more of this over the years, or decide that actually they're going to totally abandon dance and start become, I don't know, move into banking. I had a few
Yeah.
graduates who did that, and that's beautiful to see how they have evolved. I see we've got one. There's one beautiful grad. I mean, when I say beautiful, she was always stunning, or had model, kind of looks, and that she's now a full-time model. And so when I see her on Instagram, I go, oh, that's just beautiful, just to see just how they have found
Yeah.
themselves. So evolving is really important, and finding yourself. So connections and evolving, those are my two tropes that I kind of, hold on to.
Yeah. And, there's something so beautiful about, I had a dance school for 23 years. My ethos was it was a space where if people wanted to have a career. There was a pathway for the structure and the development of the technique and artistry, and then I'd send them off to full-time schools. But majority didn't want that. They just wanted to have a space where they could express themselves. And watching them go off and have their own careers in their own different fields, it's really interesting and it's beautiful. And for me, I hope that dance gave them some confidence or some language along the way to be able to find themselves in their adult world.
That's so interesting. With two young children, I'm a parent volunteer, and I quite strategically choose what voluntary work I want to do with the school. I have a limited amount of time juggling a full-time job, in academic studies and musical theatre and dance. So voluntary time is really precious. I wanted to go back into the studio, and I've been teaching, particularly with reception. So four going on to five, age four going on to five, and we do a lot more creative work. But then in another remit, we look at year one, where learning becomes a little bit more formal. It's a mixed gendered class, so we've got boys and girls. Some have done ballet, some haven't done ballet, or movement in general, but they have done with me in their reception year. But I know in that class, most of the children will not go on to a vocational training or may continue with their dancing in their extracurricular classes. But I look at even every single boy in that class and every single girl in that class, and we must learn how to listen. We must learn how to observe. We must learn how to communicate without talking. I wait for you, Kate. It's your turn to do, your 8 counts, and then it's my turn, and I'll expect you to wait for me to dance. And we look and we observe respectfully. Now, that's not going to be, them ready to audition for the JA, Royal Ballet School JA program. Never in a million years will. Maybe one or two has the little talent, and you kind of go, oh, wouldn't it be great if they did do recreational? But that's all right. That's not what we're there for. We're there to learn about how to work together. We're also there to learn how to work individually on kinesthetic awareness in the space, learning to apply my numeracy, my literacy into my experience, and being more aware of my body. And if the children leave that in that little volunteer, 4 weeks of teaching, 40 minutes, that's all they get, which is really sad, but it's as good as they can get. As I said, I always think if I don't go in to do those classes in curriculum, they wouldn't have anything. So for me, every little bit is a bonus. And that's what it's there for. It's not there to make them the next, well, you never know, you might have the next Justin Peck choreographer in that group. But it's really there for them to become better human beings, learning to listen, learning to observe, responding with grace and without charging across the room to take your shoes off, socks in your shoes, and charge across the space. So, again, it's all about education and learning to be with other people. That's for me, the big joy of leading dance, participating in a dance class. So yeah, I hear what you're saying about, you run a school and how many are going to end up, but we know it's not about how many Darcy Bustles you produce, or some people would like that, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot more, isn't it?
A lot more.
And I want to segue back. I get quite fascinated with improvisation in relation to contemporary dance and choreography. I'd love to know what piques your interest in dance choreography today.
That's a really important question. I've started moonlighting as a critic, and I really thought I was the biggest fraud going into the, theatre and writing from a critic's point of view. It took me a long time to go, oh, I think I can maybe, share my thoughts on what works, what didn't work. There was one particular moment, I was reviewing a particular company, and the choreographer had 3 men partnered with 3 women. So each couple, where he was standing, she was down on the floor, and the choreographer made or asked the dancers to drag the women across the floor. And I thought, in this day and age, we cannot be dragging women across the floor. That is, please. So I did find my voice in one of my reviews to say, it's just not, don't do it. Don't drag women across the floor, particularly in the Me Too era.
Yeah.
And I think, choreographers are, unless you're really so established that you've got this sort of palette of nuances where you go, oh yes, I'm going to see an all Wielden program where somebody can carry off an entire program. And even within an entire Wielden program, there's stuff that I really enjoy and others that go, oh, gosh. Or interestingly, when I watched the all Wielden program at the Opera House a couple of weeks ago now, the opening piece, I had watched it in 2007. And I can't tell you how nostalgic I felt because I thought, whoa, that is bringing such a powerful memory of being back, A, in a different theatre, B, watching a very different cast. And this was the New York City Ballet dancers performing in Morphosis, the Wielden company. But I thought, how powerful it can choreography be to have these big emotions to go, gosh, that's really annoyed me, or that took me back, way back, or gosh, this was a really beautiful kind of elevating, exhilarating, beautiful piece. So I think there's what's really sort of important is that we keep in mind that different choreographers have different sensibilities, have different backgrounds, and they can be shaping the form in so many different ways. That's the beauty
Yeah.
of it, to be able to tell a story or to abstract an idea. So lots of things pique my interest. I really enjoy going back, and I remember when it first came out in 2016, and I remember vividly because we were working on the contemporary ballet book in its infancy. We had just signed the contract. I had a young PhD student who was still in their early careers writing about dance. So I said, well, if I'm going to mentor this person writing the chapter, I need to go and watch. This was Kathy Marston's Jane Eyre.
Yeah.
And I watched it a couple of months ago, and I still thought, even if it was, however, 6 years old as a ballet, it still brings out Kathy Marston's key nuances as a choreographer, her key interests, but also her love of literature and introducing literature to maybe audiences who may not have read Jane Eyre as a staple literature text. In England, it's part and parcel. You kind of know about the Bronte sisters, but if you went into different countries, what would you? And I had that moment the other day. I reviewed New Adventures in The Midnight Bell, and it was fascinating. This was Matthew Bourne's choreography for his own company, and I just thought, how powerful is dance that you're able to introduce, quite almost talking about the almost forgotten writer from the 1930s. And I just thought, I'd never heard of Hamilton as a writer. And I really thought, gosh, this reminds me of a similar writer, Graham Greene, from that particular period. But still, it was just beautiful to be able to experience an insight into, a narrative which I would have never maybe have come across. And what would it, I haven't quite got to getting the book off Amazon or my local
Yeah.
library, but I definitely will go and read in my free time some of this literature that I had no idea about. So there's so many things to pique, people's interest, whether you're, a dance scholar or you just enjoying the theatre, enjoying
Yeah.
going to watch. So yeah.
I recently went to, because I'm living in Detmold in Germany at the moment, and I recently went to the Landers Theatre. Detmold's got a ballet company here, a smaller company. And the director, Katharina Torsten, I'll put it in the show notes because I can't remember the name because it's in German. I'm learning German language. And the show she choreographed was so thoughtful and so clever. It was all about what happens behind the scenes in dance. So she created the whole piece as almost like a backstage experience. And the emotional roller coaster I went on in the audience member, being a dancer and being able to relate all of these beautiful emotions that she so delicately intertwined throughout this piece. I left the experience thinking, wow, I just get so fascinated as to what moves people, why they're creating and what that intention is behind it, but also just that gift through the storytelling of dance and no words needed, just movement, music, and choreography. It's such a fascinating thing, isn't it? So, what concerns you in the dance world right now, and what gives you hope for the future?
Big concern is privilege. I think that's something that, again, we've talked a little bit about, people accessing the theatre, and there's so many different global crises that start to economically affect maybe parents and being able to take your children to the theatre or offer them classes or just, enriching their young lives. Concerns about, inclusivity, that we're not necessarily, are we losing touch with allyship, particularly with the LGBTQ community, and particularly certainly, there's some legal developments in England that could have some changes to how we perceive people from the trans community who we love dearly and want them to feel respected, but also inclusivity, that we need to make sure that we are recognizing difference and keep recognizing difference, because that's the richness that comes from that. And I am hopeful that education, scholarship, dance communities sustain all of this. And I think one thing that has been really enriching for me as a human being, editing the Oxford Handbook of Ballet Pedagogy, which when it comes out, it will be an eye-opening, or maybe in some cases not always eye-opening. So, oh yes, but there've always been kind of activities on working with older people. There's been a whole sort of remit of working with older adults, but it very rarely has been an opportunity to bring everybody to this mega big table, where people can talk about their practice without worrying that they're going to be shoehorned into a particular space, and they're just all about the different abilities, or they're just all about race, or they're just all about Indigenous people. And what happens when you start to offer a much more fluid approach in a book, where you kind of go, oh, this section is all about this and this section's all about that, but in it you get all the different multi-layers. So I am hopeful that we learn from each other, that we continue to learn from each other. It is about empathy, really. And that's what gives me hope, that even if the world around us, which every time I open the BBC app on my iPhone, I kind of start to worry, going, what's tomorrow going to bring? And knowing that there's so many difficult things happening in the world at this time. I think just for us to calibrate and get into a space where we can find peace for ourselves. I know I myself cannot fix the world, but at least I can give within my remit, within my day-to-day job in supporting students through their academic studies, that I bring some peace and some solace to them, even if, changes to legislation may really upset certain students. And we just need to be mindful. And that's what my hope is, that we, using the arts, that we can find. And of course, the arts, unfortunately, is getting a good rap on its head at the moment, because there's so much more other stuff that's going on, that actually investing in the arts feels like a big privilege to be talking about, when there's all sorts of other stuff happening outside. And I feel like I wrote the word turbulence down, because that's what it feels like when you're on an aeroplane and there's, the plane is shaking, you've got turbulence. What do you do in those moments? What do you hold on to?
Yeah.
For me, going to the theatre, watching a movie, reading a book, listening to music, that gives me hope, in the hope that humanity will get better.
Because ultimately, we're people. We're all human. That's what we are. That's what we have, is each other. And I know for me, I feel like there's sometimes this just a lack of community amongst humanity. So I love what you're saying.
And finding your tribe is really important. Once you find your tribe, and that you've got your back. A very good friend of mine teaches down the road morning classes, and she always tells me her timetable is mostly older learners, with some regular graded classes for children. But the older participants going to class, finding their solace, finding their hope, really, it gets them out of bed, it gets them dressed, it gets them communicating and being with other people. And it's just such an important element to be able to connect with people, find your tribe, and be part of a community. Because, as you mentioned, we're human, and without others, we just become, solo on an island.
Yep. It's essential. No, for sure. I've noticed, because I've been living in Germany for a year, I'm integrating into a society where I don't know the language, even though my husband speaks German. And it's been very interesting for me to sit with the vulnerabilities that come up, to not judge them, to not think, oh, I shouldn't be feeling this way. I'm a 44-year-old woman. I should. So actually, I feel very vulnerable. I'm learning a language. I don't have my friends and my extended family here. And so that I've also been going to German class with a lot of Ukrainian refugees. And it's what I'm seeing over here. The divide as well, the beautiful German community, yes, receiving them with open arms and some not so, but the integration process, it's just so humbling and what's happening just up the road. So I just think we're all human. We're all human. We're all here and let's all look out for each other.
It's a little bit like, on the playground when somebody says, oh, you don't need to come and play with us because we're not going, we're going to do something and you're not coming along. And that hurtfulness starting from that playground, it's on a bigger scale. It's on a bigger scale, but it is, kind of that childishness of cutting people out, which is, and I think actually dance has got the power to shape. We are all doing this exercise. We may have some modifications to this particular style, maybe because you don't have a left arm and you can't hold on to your left arm. That's absolutely fine. But I think it's such an important lesson, and that's where dance has got the power to go. It doesn't matter where you've come from. It doesn't matter that your parents are migrants and you're the first generation growing up in England. That going to a dance class gives you that almost, we've all got the same foundation. We are all learning how to skip. We're all learning how to count and wait for our turn. It could do so much. It's got so much power. And of course, so many people have advocated for that. So let's hold on to, that big advocacy for dance. Yeah.
And if you could whisper one thing to every young dancer entertaining a profession, what would it be?
Keep an open mind. Some children have that sort of little carrot going, that's exactly what I'm working towards. That's my goal. And other children don't have that. And as you go through life as a young person, think about what your skills are, where your skill set is, where your passions lie, and what happens if they collide. That's the exciting thing. What happens if your love for dance, and I know love feels a little bit emotion and emotive, really. And I say to
Not for me.
I say to my students, stop talking about your love for dance. That's not what we're interested in. Of course, it is really important. But let's analyze what kind of, what is valuable in this sort of part of your training when we're reflecting on, how did I get here and what am I doing and how can I improve? So I do say to them, stop saying you love dance. Yeah, we know you do. But no, in reality, if you do enjoy a particular topic, it could be football, it could be rugby, it could be anything. What if you could combine the best of both worlds and be inspired by those who have come before you? And where could you go next? So bide time as well, because things unfold as a result of all of these different collisions of ideas and concepts and things you enjoyed in after school club. I always was fascinated, particularly with the teacher training crew that came into, the students who applied. Most of them came because they just loved being in the studio. They had role models like you, shaping classes and running a dance school, and it was their happy place. And that's where most of our students sort of auditioned, from that kind of remit of going, I was hugely inspired by my dance teacher. But also even in dance and musical theatre, where they've done this because this is what kept them sane. They had ADHD or they had all sorts of different difficulties being a carer for their parents or a sibling. And this has given them a space, a happy space. And if they could forge forward with this, even if they don't end up on the West End or on Broadway, that's not what education is about. It's about giving you a path. And that's why I think most people go on to do BA programs, is largely because it's a certificate, a portal to get you onto another level, a job interview, something else. Same with diplomas as well. But more importantly, we know that people are going to end up on the West End. It's like in the ballet world. You've got your little, top 5-10% of students, but that doesn't mean that everybody else doesn't get into something in their lives. You know, they may find their
Exactly.
calling as a writer, as a critic, as a scholar, as a teacher. They may abandon and go into finance, but you know,
Yeah.
they're finding that discipline in life. I was saying to my 8-year-old, discipline is really important. And he said, "Why, mummy?" And I said, "Because it's what gets us out of bed in the morning, doing what we need to do, going to school, doing all our activities, learning about being with people, tolerating others, enjoying others, and then we come home and we've got to do it all over again." And
Yeah.
having that commitment to saying, I will be a good human being. And
Mm.
so hang in there, folks. Especially,
Yeah, I love
you
it.
know, 14, 15, 16, I never in a million years thought I would publish books. And I'm not saying to go, oh gosh, because I've done a couple of books, but what I enjoy the most, and I never thought I would get to this point in my career. So people listening up in the whisper, mentoring people is the most rewarding thing. And that does come with time, but just being with other people and seeing them grow and develop, whether they're principals at New York City Ballet, shaping their voice in writing, or supporting academic staff members in marking and moderating and being fair to the students, or understanding special educational needs and how do we work with people with SEND to really kind of think about what's their potential, how do we bring their best potential out. So be patient, but also don't worry if you meander across a little path that you never thought you'd go down. It can be truly exhilarating.
Oh, well, I think you are just beautiful, Katrina. And thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your inspiration for me and for everyone listening. You're really a treasure.
Thank you, Kate.